Hello and welcome to the Deep Dive Perspective. The war in West Asia is having an impact which often goes unseen. One of those impacts is on Europe. It seems as though Europe is the loyal tail that wags every time America basically barks. And it doesn't seem to have any solid policy of its own in terms of foreign policy. And now its economic reality is being undermined and dismantled brick by brick. First, there was the Ukraine crisis, in which the Americans seem to want to pull out their real support for any war on Russia. And of course, the EU is adamant, and Britain as well, are adamant that they want to continue. That's not exactly been in their interest or to their benefit economically. And then in West Asia, we've seen another situation where the Hormuz has been shut down, and now the Americans are blockading the Hormuz. Again, does it affect America a great deal? Well, the US has its own oil, it has its own gas. So arguably, they get less impacted by this than Europe. And Europe itself, of course, along with the rest of the world, will be the fall guys. With me to discuss this is former EU Member of Parliament, Mick Wallace. Mick, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And we've also got Myriam Charabaty, a journalist based in Beirut in Lebanon. And of course, we've seen this weekend and for the last 2 years, Lebanon assaulted by Israel, that nation which, again, the Europeans just don't seem to want to divorce themselves from in any way, shape or form. There seems to be either a guilt trip or a Zionist lobby or European assets that want to continue supporting wars in Lebanon in the favor of Israel. And I'm sure Miriam will have a lot to say about this. But European foreign policy is what my focus is going to be. Mick, your time at the Parliament and in EU was an interesting one. I'd follow you very regularly, and you were very outspoken in ripping apart that institution. But they seem to have given away their foreign policy altogether. What do you think?
Well, they've never really had an independent foreign policy of their own. I suppose really from around 2015 on, they worked at forging a closer alignment with NATO. And, just people get confused about who NATO are sometimes. And especially when Trump starts complaining about him. But the truth is that NATO is an entity that was formed by the US in order to control the Europeans, and is completely controlled by the US still today. So this idea when Trump gives out about NATO and threatens it and this, that, and the other, I mean, that's obviously just a load of baloney talk. Because NATO is a convenient instrument for the Americans to make sure that none of the Europeans go off and do anything on their own bat, and that they really can only do something with America's blessing. So, but look at, I mean, the European Union was very much perceived as a sort of a peace project, in the sense that, after the Second World War, it was formed shortly after the Second World War, and the idea was, it was said that we should never have a war like this again, and we need to work together or whatever, right? But in actual fact, it had a lot to do with the promotion of capitalism more than the promotion of peace. And that's what we're seeing today. You were making the point that America has its own gas and its own oil, and they shouldn't be as worried about the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. But this is really about capitalism more than anything else. And the US empire is hell-bent on promoting capitalism morning, noon and night. And they have the Europeans for bedfellows because they're on the same page. And the of Iran to actually stand up against Western imperialism is a big problem for them, because it has the potential to put a serious dent in the capitalist project in West Asia, and this is a problem for them. And they don't want to let go their control of the choke point called Hormuz. America has used its the superiority and dominance of the dollar since Bretton Woods, which was established in 1944, just before the end of the Second World War, where the dollar was made the world's number one currency. And the Americans have been able to use that in order to whip everybody else into line. If you don't play ball with them, they make life difficult for you. Because of the dollar's dominance, they can introduce sanctions. They can threaten other nations about doing business with you. And the petrodollar is very, very, very important to the Americans still. And the Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz is a problem for the petrodollar, because while it doesn't do away with it, and it won't, it does undermine it, and it does reduce its strength. And that's a big problem for them. You're right that the Americans have their own gas, they have their own oil. And you're right that the Europeans have been in a kamikaze mode, especially since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, where we stopped buying cheap fuel and energy from the Russians, and we started buying filthy, expensive LNG from the US. And it reached a point where a German car manufacturer making something like a Mercedes car, the guy in Germany making the Mercedes was paying 4 times more for US LNG than the guy in America that was making the Mercedes. And the notion that he could compete in the long term, given that energy is such a big portion of the cost of production, things weren't really adding up. And what you have seen is German companies, rather than expand at home in Germany, are actually increasing their footprint in the US and China, where they can access cheaper fuel. In the US, they can access the cheap American products, and in China, they can access the cheaper Russian energy products. So this has been pure madness on the part of the Europeans, but we have an awful lot of very disappointing people making decisions in Europe at a political level at the moment. Aside from von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas at Foreign Affairs, 2 dangerous individuals, not very bright. And then you have the likes of Starmer in England, Macron in France, Merz in Germany. Where would you find them? It's hard to credit that we've had such so many bad, disappointing, inept leaders at the one time. So listen, that's all part of the problem. But there's a lot of things going on, and that's just part of it.
Well, thank you. That's given us a great introduction to the woes of Europe, almost the sick man of the world in many ways in the near future, because petrol prices, other prices, inflation, the possibility of an economic collapse, which was already imminent, looked like they would hit us here in Europe far harder than many, many other places. And our resilience is certainly going to be tested. But shifting to you, Miriam, that's their problem. Of course, the Europeans have been equally responsible for what's going on in West Asia. They've been very willing supporters of Donald Trump in many ways. How have you seen it play out? How has that European support of the American projects and the Zionist projects in your part of the world, and of course in Iran as well? You've been watching. We haven't had you on since the war has kicked off. The latest wars with Iran have kicked off. But your overview about the failures of the European establishment to abide by all those noble, virtuous signals they give off around democracy, equality, human rights and, the rule of law. Where has all that gone?
How do I put that nicely? Basically, Europe's problems inherently become our problems, because when Europe starts losing its influence or its capacity inside of Europe, it will seek to expand its influence and seek to extract more of the resources of the rest of the world, especially places it has historically colonized. So that would make us and Africa primary targets of European kind of pro-genocide positioning. And so from that perspective, when we look at what, for example, just to talk about Lebanon specifically, when we look at where the French stand, the French have two very significant concerns in Lebanon. One is it remains the last post of their influence in West Asia, largely, and that has to do with their ties to the Christian group in Lebanon. And because Lebanon is a sectarian, divided country, each sect has a certain foreign backing, in a sense. And so for the Christians, the backing is Western, typically French, and then from there it extends. And so ultimately for the French, they have two concerns. One, if the resistance succeeds in liberating the region, they will no longer have any influence in the region. That given the US would not have influence in the region, and they have much smaller portion of that. That's on one end. On the other end, if Israel does expand, they have another problem, because Israel will take over the resources they seek to extract from Lebanon, and Israel would have the greater resource extraction and influence. So for the French, they neither want the resistance to succeed, nor do they want Israel typically to succeed. The ideal for them is for us to remain in a state of constant oppression beneath Israeli aggression, but at a threshold where we can protect ourselves, just not enough to liberate ourselves. So basically, generations of people being killed at the hands of Israel with U.S. and European-made weapons. So from that, we understand that the European mentality in the region is not one of noble, moral, ethical, legal positions. It is purely one of interests. In Syria, the Brits have found a way to integrate themselves very nicely into the Gilani regime, right? MI6 runs all the PR campaign of HTS Syria, and it does so kind of in competition and in parallel with both Turkey and Israel. So, and it all falls under the U.S. umbrella. It's not like these are in competition with the U.S. They fall under the U.S. umbrella.
I remember, Miriam, way back, this was one of the early revelations. I was on a BBC program where they accidentally pulled me on, and I'd got a little bit of research around the French minister at that time, who had exposed the British MI6 being the prime movers in developing the Ikhwani forces in Turkey, preparing for the overthrow of Assad to create the regime change. This was in 2012, a couple of years before the war fully flared up. So I can kind of corroborate the fact that, Europe, and I count Britain in Europe, of course, has been instrumental in causing a lot of this chaos. And we've had Vanessa Beeley on here, who's given a very detailed analysis of how the MI6 are still operating there. And we, of course, also saw that the reason they seemed to go for Assad at that time and why they want to destabilize that region was that Assad refused deals, oil deals, taking oil pipelines and doing various deals with them in that region. Those are the reasons that the Europeans obviously turned on Assad and went for a concerted campaign against him. So, given this reality, has anything changed in terms of the European attitude towards that region? Would you say, is it even worse?
Well, it's even worse, but the French understand very well the balance of power in the region, and that's from a position of their own interests. So when they see that Hezbollah or the resistance has changed the balance of power, and that's something they saw up until between 2006 and 2023, right? they would attempt continuously to have discussions with Hezbollah. They would make agreements with Hezbollah, and not with the government, not with anyone else. They would seek to make their agreement with Hezbollah, and that is, for example, with Total Energy, right? They wanted the guarantees of Hezbollah because they were the ones that were gonna kind of extract resources from our maritime oil. So the French, the Europeans, they understand that very well. What they went forward for in Syria, they had an image of victory of it. But I am quite certain that in the near future, it's going to come to reveal itself as a major strategic failure, because the fall of Assad, or rather the fall of Syria, the state, into the hands of takfiris, right? That specifically is the beginning of the end of European influence in the region, because Syria was the only state that had the strength and the capability to negotiate diplomatically within a status quo of operations in the Middle East, given that the Middle East is all occupied in one way or another, directly or indirectly. The fall of that has emptied West Asia from that from the Arab world, actually, from that presence. And in turn, this will come out as one battlefield of resistance, right? It emptied the option for any ulterior reality to exist. So the options the people still have is either go for resistance or go for subjugation. And if you can convince a few to go for resistance, you can definitely not convince the majority to go for subjugation, right? So if we have the few that are going for resistance and the majority not going for subjugation, they're rather sitting and waiting to see how the balance of power will alter. What we will see, and what we have seen over the past 20 years, is more people going towards the resistance axis than there are people going towards the subjugation axis, as the resistance axis proves itself over time. And so I think this will come to show as one of the major strategic failures of the century, the attack on Syria, because when it started in 2011, 2012, the idea was if you break Syria, the resistance can no longer survive. But the resistance survived for another 15 years, thanks to Syria. And it developed for 15 years, thanks to Syria, and thanks to Iran and Iraq. It was a collective effort. And that time period has changed the reality that the fall of Syria would mean the fall of the resistance. The resistance axis has become strong enough to sustain itself, to revive Syria even after its fall. And the fall of Syria definitely had some impact on the resistance axis. But clearly, 2026 war has proven it has definitely not eliminated its capabilities or broken its back. It has created a chaos, and chaos is something that can be very tragic in a lot of ways, but it can also be exploited by friends, foes, equally.
So, Mick, you've heard Miriam. Do come back on anything that comes to mind from what she said. But I'm interested in the fact that the Europeans haven't been so keen on going in and supporting the Americans in terms of this blockade. The Americans, whether they consulted them or not, they weren't very keen on joining Donald Trump's efforts to open up the Strait of Hormuz. So they don't listen to everything. When they know when their ships are going to be destroyed, and they seem to be smart enough to avoid that. Question this kind of this flip-flopping of the Europeans and their relationship with Trump, but also anything you want to take up on what Miriam said.
I found what Miriam was saying was very interesting, and I agree very much with what she has to say. I found it interesting about her point that the population have to pick between resistance and subjugation now, and the idea that they're all going to accept subjugation is a bit of a stretch. But the European approach to Syria for since 2011 has been pathetic. Look, some people would say, and there's obviously some truth in it as well. I mean, the destruction of Syria, and God knows the West who initially armed ISIS and then armed Al-Qaeda with a view to destroying the whole goddamn region. They bear a huge responsibility for the massive destruction that's taken place. And the manner in which they've accommodated Jalani, who was chopping heads off a few years back, and they had a problem with him then, but now they've no problem with him. And I mean, he's the ruler. He's supposed to be the ruler in Syria now. And us Europeans, with our European values and human rights and democracy, we don't seem to have any problem with the fact that he wasn't elected. We have no problem with the fact that he was involved with Al-Qaeda, that he was involved with ISIS. I mean, it just completely exposes the Europeans to who they are. I mean, we don't have values. We have interests, and our interest in the destruction of Syria, because that's what's taken place, is linked to Israel's interest there as well. And Israel wants a broken Syria so that it can do what it likes in the areas near itself, and it can expand into it when it feels like it. And the Europeans have supported that. I mean, people should never forget, right? I mean, you get carried away sometimes with what the Europeans say when they talk about humanitarian law and human rights and all this and European values. But these people supported the genocide. These people have supported the genocide since 1948, right? These guys invented it, right? Zionism is a settler colonial project invented by the Europeans and Americans, right? And it's their project. So it suits them fine. I mean, it isn't just that Israel is an evil, demonic entity, which it is, right? It's a terrorist organization. It's lawless. It's apartheid. It's everything bad you could think of, and it has no respect for humanity. But you know what? It isn't just a case that Israel are just running rampant in the region, which obviously the Europeans and the Americans let them do in West Asia. But it actually suits these people. It suits the colonialist mindset in Europe and America. As Biden said 30 years ago, if Israel didn't exist, they'd have to invent it. And Israel is a military outpost for US empire in West Asia. And, obviously there's other aspects to it and that are scary as well. But broadly, Israel suits the West. And they support it morning, noon, and night. They can kill 20,000 children plus in Gaza. And the European Union still didn't condemn Israel. Now, mother of God, what would Israel have to do? They killed 2,000 people plus in Lebanon in less than 2 weeks. And the Europeans were saying, oh, no, that shouldn't be happening now. This must stop. But did any of them stop doing business with Israel? I'm afraid not. The Irish government, for example, I'm Irish, and the Irish government say nice things about, we must protect the Palestinians. Oh, must we now? Must we protect the Palestinians? Well, why are we still doing business with Israel? Do you know that Ireland is doing more business with Israel than any other of the 27 EU member states?
Goodness.
We're doing more business with them than anybody. Then this is in a country where the public are very much pro-Palestinian. They're pro-resistance. They don't like empire very much. They don't like the Zionist project very much. But the government say nice things, but do nothing, only support Israel. So our government too, like the rest of the European governments, have supported the genocide. It's nice that Spain has found a little bit of courage of late.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, the Europeans have been a shambles, and it's a disgrace, and they don't have the right. I mean, Kaya Callas started to talk about international law there last Friday or Saturday. Mother of God, how can she have the audacity to talk about international law? These people who supported the genocide in Gaza, supported the ethnic cleansing in South Lebanon, had no problem with the destruction of Yemen since 2015 on and off. They didn't even condemn the US-Israeli illegal attack on Iran. They didn't condemn the invasion of Venezuela. They didn't condemn the blockade of Cuba. These people have no credibility. I mean, I'm surprised sometimes how people tend to think that the Europeans are somebody different. But these are the former colonialists, and they haven't really changed their mindset. I was on the Security and Defence Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee when I was there, right?
Right.
There was a mission to Mozambique while I was there, and I went on it. There was only 7 of us went, because there's 7 groups in the parliament, and there was one from each group allowed go. So I went from the so-called left group, which isn't very left, and down to Mozambique to see. We went to review 2 EU training missions in Mozambique. 2 EU training missions, right? Now you wonder, what in God's name is the EU down in Mozambique training soldiers? Well, as it turned out, I mean, Mozambique is a long way down. It borders South Africa, right? It turns out, and Mozambique is a former Portuguese colony, right? So we went down anyway to look at these 2 training missions. So what materialized was that in the northern part of Mozambique, a place called Cabo Delgado, which is actually the only Muslim region in the country, there's been a massive gas find on land and in the sea. So the government, which is a pretty disappointing government down there that serves Western interests more than it serves the interests of its own people, but they invited in Total Energies from France and Eni from Italy to explore the prospect of excavating for this gas on land or sea. So after about a year, Total Energy says, yeah, we'll do it. We'll explore it. We're prepared to explore for gas on the land, not the sea, it's too expensive. But we'll start exploration on the land. But the government said there's one problem. There's about 2,000 farmers on the land at the moment, and we don't want to get involved in that, so you'll have to get rid of them. So Total Energies hired mercenaries to get rid of the farmers who happened to be of a Muslim persuasion, and the farmers weren't very happy about it. And there was some Muslim fighters in adjacent countries who came in to help them, and the farmers got guns. And before you knew it, there was a war because the farmers were protecting their land from a French invader that wanted to exploit the place for their own financial benefit. And a war started. So what's the EU doing down there? We're in Mozambique spending EU taxpayers' money, training young Mozambique kids, 17, 18, 19 years of age, training them to fight so that they can help to clear the land in Cabo Delgado so that Total Energies from France can make a fortune. And Total Energies said that if they can go ahead with the project, they said it would be after around 2032 before gas would appear, and it'd be 2040 before there'd be any dividend for Mozambique, but that they were prepared to ring fence 10% of the profits for Mozambique from 2040 on. The truth be told, the people of Mozambique weren't going to get a penny out of this. And we have EU personnel spending EU taxpayers' money down there, training young Mozambique kids to fight against other Mozambique people in the north of Mozambique, so that Total Energies can make.
Well, that's a great example. I think I could probably say cut and paste and repeat. That's literally kind of modern day Anglo-Zionist European imperialism in a nutshell, because it links that hidden factor of the capitalism you talked about earlier, i.e. serving transnational organizations, the techno-feudal future that's coming and the companies that are involved in that. That's often the byproduct, or actually the main reason for doing all this, some would argue. Miriam, it's not an unfamiliar scenario to you. And I was trying to also focus on the fact that the Europeans got cold feet when Trump was trying to force them into the West Asia crisis in a military sense. They are operating, though, because French fighters and European fighters, British fighters, are there to defend Israel, for sure. We know that they did that in both those wars with Iran. There's also the knowledge now that people like Matt Kennard, journalists like Matt Kennard, have been revealing here, where Britain is actually supplying drones and other facilities and aircraft which were actually circling Gaza while the genocide was going on, literally giving reconnaissance and surveillance information to the Israelis and essentially being actively part of the war and the genocide. And I heard about a week ago that there was a British drone above Lebanon, South Lebanon as well. This kind of constitutes actual participation of the war, whether or not it's like frontline missile firing or not. They're still part of the war on the people of West Asia, aren't they?
Absolutely. In fact, just hours before the April 8th massacre, where Israel dropped about 150 bombs on very crowded civilian streets and buildings, killing over 350 people, with about 100 people that we could not identify. And we had to have the parents come in to try to identify them, identify the bodies by what they're wearing or by something that the parents could recognize. And so just before that happened, the British drones were actually circling overhead in Lebanon. Similarly, we have seen throughout the war from 2023 onward, because the war in Lebanon also started on 2023, right? The support front for Gaza was opened by Martyr Said Hassan on October 8th. And from then on, we've had continuous existence of European, Western military intelligence presence operations over our skies and within our lands and seas. And so from that perspective, yes, the French have also been circling the borders between Lebanon and Syria. Similarly, the British, we also have British warships just off of our shores. We have German warship just off of our shore. If you remember back in 2024 during the war, a man was kidnapped from Batroun, which is just north of the country. And it's a majority a Christian area known for its nightlife. A guy, he's a boat captain, ship captain. He was kidnapped from Batroun. And then on that day, what we do know for a fact is that there were German boats UNIFIL boats between us and the Israelis. So what happened there? Right? It's worth asking, how did the Israelis get through, conduct a commando operation, get out without being seen by the Germans? Is that, or is it that the Germans work for the Israelis, right? Like they work in a mutual interest. And we have the same thing when we talk about UNIFIL. Talking about no European military involvement is a whole lot of crap, to be honest, because UNIFIL is an intelligence agency functioning in service of the Israelis. And just 2 days ago, there was an incident with the French troops where they entered one of the towns and they were shot at. And to be frank, at this point, Southerners are all willing to shoot at French UNIFIL officers because they have been the primary eyes and ears of Israel and southern Lebanon, knowing exactly that they have called, given people's names to Israel to assassinate them, to target them, locations, houses, tunnels, trenches, and all of that. And so in parallel to that, we also have the presence of British presence on the mountains between Lebanon and Syria. All of these are operational capabilities of Europe. What they're not capable of is they're not capable of entering a kinetic military war. And that's just because of their failure militarily. That's not because they don't want to. So they are very present on the intelligence side.
So the other aspect that I raised was their kind of reluctance to be involved with the Americans against Iran directly. I noticed that when Trump went ballistic and psychotic, beyond what even some of the soft liberals here would be able to tolerate, that tweet where he said that he would wipe out or something an entire civilization, the Iranian civilization, and that was like something which was hinting at perhaps tactical nuclear weapons being used, the escalation of the war to that next level, and him literally threatening that. It did seem to freeze a lot of the European leaders. They didn't come out in support of that. I'm not sure what the real response was, but did you pick up much in terms of the way Europe is viewing Trump's behavior against Iran? Because of course, fighting Iran is another ball game. It's different from dealing with, say, the resistance in Lebanon or Mozambique, as been cited, or even Burkina Faso, where the French have been almost booted out with the pillaging of the gold, etc., that they were doing. But of course, you've got an entire scenario where in some places European foreign policy is being pushed back, and their rape of those nations is being resisted, and that's the case in Iran, of course. But why have they been a little bit hesitant of following Trump all the way there? Do you think in that Iranian situation?
So I think primarily, especially the Brits, they don't really have any maritime capability to go into such large-scale kinetic war. Their equipment is no longer viable for that kind of confrontation, and we've seen that. We've known that since the war in Ukraine, and the war. Well, I guess it's the war from Ukraine on Russia. Ideally, it's the NATO war on Russia that was driven to come off as a war in Ukraine. They came out and they said that, well, our ships are largely incapable of going to war right now, and we should, spend more money to ameliorate that situation. And that situation has not been ameliorated since then. So that's on one end. On the other end, going to war with Iran also means getting into a confrontation with Turkey at one point or another. Getting directly involved could result into a direct confrontation with Turkey, and that would be a major issue for the Europeans. Similarly, I don't think the Europeans perceive the capacity of the US and Israel to win this war as a conclusive capacity, rather as an attempt to weaken the capabilities of Iran and the region. So the Europeans are managing the intelligence and the regional influence, while the Americans are playing the lunatic president card, and then saying, and if it fails, they will say, oh, look, we had a lunatic president. We are changing the administration and everything's going to be fine. If it wins, it wins. And then the Europeans will find their way into serving US interests in the region. But ideally, I don't think the Europeans perceive the capacity for a kinetic war to conclude in any successful way. And they don't have the capacity to do what the US would ultimately want of them.
Okay. Mick, turning to you, the Ukraine question keeps coming back, and I'm going to have to address it as a European foreign policy, including Britain as well. They're still saber-rattling. I mean, they're still financing the Ukraine. They're still a little bit miffed, it seems, with Donald Trump's flip-flopping and kind of like trying to pally up with Putin 1 minute and then the next minute telling them off. And, America's kind of like vagueness. Is that just deception? Are they just playing good cop, bad cop, letting the Europeans take the front line against the Russians in order for, I guess, more weapons to be sold to the Europeans, more money to be made by American tech companies, presumably? But what's going on there with the war on Russia by NATO and the Ukraine?
From the start, the Europeans didn't want the war to end. They wanted it to start. They didn't want it to stop. Likewise, the Americans. Now, and you might think that the Americans are not playing ball as much these days, but the Americans are still giving plenty of assistance to Ukraine. And while they like to talk to Putin on and off and explore options, America is very happy to keep the war going. This war is going on for over 4 years, right? And it wouldn't be going on for 4 years if Ukraine wasn't being supported by NATO, right? And as Miriam said, the Europeans don't have a whole lot to be thrown into West Asia at the moment because they've thrown the kitchen sink at Ukraine. They've exhausted an awful lot of their resources militarily on Ukraine. And they've managed to keep this war going. And Russia is a big power. It's a big army, and they still haven't taken all of Donbass. Which after 4 years, who'd have thought that Russia couldn't take Donbass in 4 years? But Russia isn't just fighting Ukraine; it's fighting the whole West, and it's a war. I mean, it's hard to win wars these days anyway. I mean, the last war the Americans won, I think, was in Grenada, right? When they went into destroy the left-wing movement there, right? That's a long, long time ago, right? It's hard to win wars. And even where the opposition was weak, like in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, they could never claim to have won the wars. And by God, they're not going to win a war with Iran. Because Iran have capacity to defend themselves, which the others didn't have, right? And now the Europeans weren't able to condemn the illegal US-Israeli invasion of Iran. They weren't able to find within themselves to condemn it, even though it was 100% in breach of international law, completely against the UN Charter, but they couldn't condemn it because that's what they're like nowadays, right? But were they going to send ships to the Straits of Hormuz? Well, they weren't, because you know why? Because they're toppled, their governments have been toppled at home if their own citizens were being killed in the Straits of Hormuz, because they would have been killed in it, right? Iran are able to defend Hormuz from land, and the people coming in are going to try and upset that from ships. They'll be sitting ducks, right? It won't work. And it's the Europeans are not totally stupid, right? Even though they're very disappointing, but they're not totally stupid, and they're not capable of having a serious influence in changing the situation in the Persian Gulf. Now, at the weekend, there was a conference in Paris, right, where they said they were going to put together a military operation of ships to go to the Persian Gulf to try and keep the Strait of Hormuz open, right? That's just propaganda of their own making, right? I mean, even Trump laughed at him and said, "Will you go away?" He says, "Stay away from the place," right? Because you wouldn't come when I asked you for help, right? And I mean, but the Europeans are so pathetic at the moment, and this is just more posturing. But I mean, Ukraine, I mean, the media in Europe haven't been able to talk about the war in Ukraine without calling it the unprovoked war in Ukraine. And the only reason they call it unprovoked was because it was provoked, right, by NATO expansion. And the dogs on the street know that the war was provoked. Russia were wrong to invade. It's a breach of the UN Charter, but they were provoked, right? So let's just tell the truth, right? And in December 21, the Russians made contact with the Americans and NATO and the Europeans, and they laid out the conditions for not invading. And NATO laughed at them. And Stoltenberg laughed about the whole prospect at our committee in Brussels. He came in and he said that the Russians wanted us to agree to an end to NATO expansion and for Ukraine not to go into NATO. And he laughed and he says, well, we were never going to agree to that. He boasted about provoking the war. And yet we have a media in Western Europe who insist on calling it an unprovoked war. There was a chance of a peace in Easter 22. And Boris Johnson was sent over to Ukraine to make sure that peace didn't break out. The Europeans have spent billions, hundreds of billions at this stage, making sure the war doesn't stop. And the Americans don't want it to stop either. Trump might have liked a nice, sweet deal where he was going to get credit for ending the war at the start. Maybe yes, maybe no. But he's done very little to change the mathematics of it all. And the war is going on, and that suits the Americans and it suits the Europeans. It's destroying Ukraine, and it's bound to be undermining Russia's resources too, which is part of the plan. But people should know that on the western side of Ukraine, Ukrainians were forced to change their constitution so that Western corporations, the European and American, could buy up huge tracts of land for peanuts, because that was illegal up until 2021. But they had to change the constitution, and now large European and American corporations have bought more land for peanuts in Western Ukraine than the Russians have taken on the east side. Now, Europeans are talking about giving Ukraine money morning, noon, and night, and they've given them an incredible amount of money. EU taxpayers' money. A lot of it is called, but 2/3 of it is called loans, right? We know they'll never, ever, ever get a penny of it back, right? This is money down the Swanee just to keep a war going. And a war, money to throw close to 1 million working class kids from Ukraine and Russia.
I think
It's mind-boggling that we're not telling the truth in Europe about what's really going on there.
yeah.
But
Well,
we're destroying Ukraine. We're colonizing Ukraine. And people are carrying on as if all this is normal.
and of course, all this money is something that the West needs, the Europeans need, because their own economies are failing. And with all this oil, gas being shut down, I don't know how they kind of can equate the idea of spending more money on wars when their own economies are literally on the precipice. Ordinary people certainly wouldn't want this if they really understood it. Yet we still seem to end up voting for the same villains. Perhaps because all sides of the voting spectrum that are capable of coming to power are villains. They're all part of the same mafia. They all answer to the same mafia. Miriam, I'm going to wind things down with yourself, really. It's, to me, war in West Asia always means migration to Europe. Europe is the one that gets the usual results in that regard. And then they cry about illegal immigration and start crying about the economy. Well, if they allow the Americans to continue the escalation of a war on Iran, it will, as you said, possibly draw in the likes of the Turks. It'll definitely mean migration of people, more population movement. What's your alternative, and what should Europe be doing in terms of a foreign policy? For instance, the Spanish have shown some direction. They've actually gone to the Chinese and started signing deals. Is that something the Europeans should have done long ago, given America is doing America first, or more accurately, Israel first policies?
Well, to be frank, I think the war on Iran is the one war that will not result in in migration to Europe, because Iranians are flying from Europe back to Iran to fight the Americans.
Okay.
This is an existential war for everyone. So I don't think this will result in that. However, definitely from the Turkish side, if the war expands to start reaching, actually spilling into Turkey, potentially India, Pakistan, potentially Afghanistan, right? Because the Americans want some presence in Afghanistan to help attack Iran. We've seen the Americans try to reach out to Indonesia to get airspace authority to fly in and out their military freely. I think that would also be for an Iran reason. So if you look at it from that perspective, I think if I had the right to give Europe an advice, which I am not very much interested in, ideally, but if I were to do that, I would say it's time to stop looking at the colonies and how you can exploit them, and start to see what you have and how you can develop your own production and your own means of production, and how you can start looking at Europe as an entity for which it is. Because a lot of the people at the end of this war depends on how it ends, and I would highly think it would end in advantage of the oppressed, in advantage of the Arab world, in advantage of the Islamic world. A lot of the people will be returning back home. A lot of the Africans, if that spills into Africa, impacts Africa, with any diminishing US, EU presence there as well. People will be returning to their homes where they belong, where they're not numbers, where they have their identity sacred to them. And Europe has to look at how it can manufacture its own economy on its own without exploiting anyone else. Because alternatively, they will become enslaved to the Americans, and they are largely halfway through that. So I think it's about time for them to start looking at things differently because they're betting on the wrong horse.
A conclusion goes to you, Mick. The Pope piped up. The Pope went all ethical and moral on Trump, and there was a big spat. I mean, I count the Pope as a European, I suppose, although he's an American, but he's kind of, the Vatican is based in Europe. So, he at least piped up, something stirred there. Of course, the people of Europe are not all bad. It's the leaderships and the oligarchy which runs these estates, which is the problem. Is there any chance of real democracy operating in Europe anytime soon? And is it the responsibility of people to take charge of this kind of systemic malaise and the oligarchical control and the Zionist control and the kind of control of techno-feudal powers? How does that happen? I mean, you've been in the democratic system and the business of politics. Is there any hope within that system, or is it the people that have to change the mechanisms?
Well, first of all, politicians never change anything, right? The people change things. Politicians don't, right? The political structures are broken, really, right? Big money plays a huge part in deciding who gets elected. And when people get elected, they return the favour. They look after those who got them elected. In the European elections these days, less than 40% on average, I'd say, vote in the European Parliament. Elections, even in national elections, is very low, in particular in Eastern Europe, right? Democracy is a funny entity, right? It's a bit overrated, right? It's seriously overrated, right? People are being arrested for protesting on behalf of Palestine in Germany and in England. Is that democracy? What's that got to do with democracy? I mean, if we had a democracy, right, in Britain, for example, right, would someone like Keir Starmer be running the country? I don't think so.
No.
I don't think that very many people in Britain actually like that idiot, because he's a complete idiot. And most of the leaders of Europe are disappointing. But big money plays a huge part in deciding who gets elected. And they serve the elite when they're elected. The politicians of Europe today serve the elite first, and the interest of the majority are secondary. And I mean, that's what capitalism is about. And these guys promote capitalism morning, noon, and night. Capitalism is it's designed to cater for the interest of a small elite at the great expense to the many. And that's what we're watching in most European countries today, including Ireland, where we've had a right-wing government for 104 years since we got away from the Brits. And our mainstream media play a certain part in that too, but so does power and money and whatever, right? But I mean, democracy is in trouble, and because it's not really democracy. Democracy would be a situation where the people would actually have a say in how their society was organized, right? I don't see much of that in Europe. I don't see many European citizens having a say in how their community has been organized, how their country has been run, how their country's foreign policy has been run. If the European politicians were serving the interest of their own people, they'd be bringing security to Europe. But security to Europe is not spending extra billions on arms and enriching the arms industry. Security for the people of Europe is doing away and challenging the housing crisis that we have all across Europe. It's introducing affordable healthcare. It's introducing affordable, good public transport. It's dealing with the challenges of climate change in an honest way, instead of telling lies every day about it and pretending to be doing things you're not doing. It's about investing more in education. It's about giving people jobs that can help them to raise their family in dignity. That's what security is about. Not buying tanks and fighter jets. And that's where they're going at the moment. The Europeans have lost the plot in terms of our political elite. But they're not the choice of our people. The people of Europe are in a different place to the political class. You've only to look at for example, just look at Palestine, right? I mean, 90% of the public in Europe are sympathetic to the fact that the Palestinians are being oppressed. There's a genocide being carried out against them since 1948. The land has been stolen off them and they've been battered to death. And we're helping the Israelis to do it. That's not what the people want. But we have a political class. In the whole of the EU, there wasn't 5% of them condemned the genocide. Not 5% of them condemned the genocide in Gaza or what's going on in Lebanon. They're a joke. But the people are different. And you might say, okay, where's change going to come? Well, it's going to have to come from the people. And things are getting so bad and so obviously bad that I honestly believe, I'm an optimist, and I do think that things are going to change for the better because things are getting so bad. And I do think as well that Gaza, the genocide in Gaza that was intensified over the last 2.5 years, is a game changer. The world is never going to be the same place again. We never saw it. There's been genocides for hundreds of years, right? Americans was formed on a genocide, as was Canada, as was New Zealand, Australia, and the Brits and the Germans and the French carried out genocides all over the planet. But this time we saw it on our telephones. This is different. People watch the genocide on their telephones on a daily basis. And people are shocked at what they've seen. They know there's something seriously amiss. And they need to realize that capitalism is a cancer to any opportunity of developing a fair society for the people anywhere. And we've got to deal with that head on.
Thanks, Mick. That's a kind of sobering set of statements to end the show on. But Miriam, just a final word to you, just quickly. What would you say to the average European? Because we've worked out that the governments are a waste of time during this show, I think, pretty much, and through the evidence that we've seen over the last 2 years especially. What would you say to the people of Europe? What would be your hope as a Lebanese citizen living in a place which gets bombed regularly by an entity which is supported by Europe, which was created by Europe, and which is essentially bearing the price of what Europeans threw away, i.e., the Zionist, project? What would your final statement be to the European people? How should they try to stop these wars on you guys out there?
My advice to the people of Europe is it's not about how to stop the wars on us. It's about how they should save themselves. They should save whatever is left of the humanity they have always thought they upheld, but discovered face first, I guess, that their governments, the mechanism, the world they live in, the economy they function is not what they thought it is. So my advice to them is to look at a way to save their humanity, save face with their own belief systems in which genocide should really not be part of that. We are good at protecting ourselves. We are good at defending ourselves, and we will make that happen. We will make it work. It's up to them to find a way to realize that if they want to keep living with what they think they are, they have to change the way they're living. They have to change the way their economy works. They have to change the way they invest, the way they look at how they engage trade with the rest of the world. We don't need saviors. We don't need you to come out and say, oh, we have to go save the Christians of the Middle East. Oh, we have to go save whatever it is from whatever part of the world. people don't need saving in the sense that you need to go and do something about it. What you need to do is to do something at home. You need to change the way you function, your everyday life, in order to change the way you impact the world. And in doing so, you are saving your own self, you are saving your own humanity. And that, above all, is how we save the world.
Very profound statements. Both of you gave us a fantastic analysis of what's wrong with European foreign policy in particular. Well, you know, the chickens do come home to roost, and they are coming home to roost. We all know that inflation and the economic collapse is pretty imminent. If it wasn't happening already because of our dalliance in Ukraine, trying to pretend that we're liberating Ukraine, well, it's definitely going to come home to roost if we don't stop what's going on against Iran, in my opinion. And if the Europeans are the ones who are going to be some of the primary victims of that, then it's we, the people, who definitely have to up the ante. We've got elections coming up. We've got, and again, usually the people who get touted as the potential leaders all have financial backing from people who are just going to make them carry on maintaining the status quo. It's a serious question. I mean, Europe's, certainly Britain, has never been one for revolution, and I'm not saying that, but certainly something really is very wrong within our system, and we cannot just continue just letting it float by as if we don't bear the responsibility of the actions of our politicians. And it's also not good enough to be apathetic and think that actually my actions don't count. It's individuals, when they're hopeless and when they lack any backbone, that ensures that these oligarchies continue. And it's only by standing up and shouting, and at least use your tongue, use your pen, use whatever you can to be able to maybe highlight people like Mick Wallace and people who are fighting for the right. I'd say people like the Workers' Party here in Britain are far closer to the reality of what Britain should be politically than certainly everything else that's out there on the market. That's my own personal opinion, not that I've ever voted, not that I ever will, not that I believe in the political democracy as it stands, but nonetheless, you know, that's at least some hope. I'd leave it to you to follow Mick on X, follow Miriam as well. You'll see their names pop up, and they're easy to find. Do follow their work and do support them, and do support DDP with our work, because we need your support to thank, like, comment, first of all, to stop the censorship on us, and secondly, to be able to help us grow so that we can carry on bringing these fantastic guests to you, so that you actually get a view of reality instead of living in the illusions which mainstream media, legacy media, Zionist-run media does deliver you on a daily basis. Thank you for watching, and thank you to my guests, Mick Wallace and Miriam, for joining us on this deep dive perspective. Goodbye.